The studio lights burned hot, glaring down on the polished desk where the night's panel sat. Cameras buzzed, their red lights fixed like watchful eyes, every angle capturing sweat, smirks, and sideways glances. The air wasn't just heavy, it was charged, the kind of atmosphere that always comes before lightning cracks open the sky. Viewers at home leaned forward, sensing instinctively this broadcast would be less debate and more battleground. Pam Bondi was ready to command it. With her signature confidence sharpened into a blade, she pounced the moment Jasmine Crockett began making her point. Crockett had barely shifted in her chair, voice low but firm, when Bondi cut across her mid-sentence. "Spare us the self-righteous lecture," Bondi snapped, lips curling into a dismissive half-smile. "You can twist this however you want, but the people at home don't need your moral grandstanding." The words cracked like a whip, slicing through the conversation, daring anyone to oppose her. Gasps rippled across the studio audience, swift and involuntary. Even the clicking of production staff keyboards faltered into silence. The camera zoomed in tightly, catching Crockett's still face, her eyes fixed, her expression unshaken. For a moment, the soundscape of the studio shifted, the humming of machinery, the faint shuffle of papers, all swallowed by a tension so thick it seemed to suffocate the very air. Other panelists shifted uncomfortably. One reached for a glass of water. Another glanced down at notes they'd suddenly lost the nerve to read aloud. Even the host, normally quick to interject, hesitated, choosing instead to let the silence stretch taut like the string of a bow. Bondi leaned back slightly, satisfied at her interruption, her smirk inching wider as though victory had already been declared. She didn't just dismiss Crockett's words, she dismissed Crockett's presence, the audacity of her speaking at all. Yet what Bondi couldn't see was that the audience wasn't smiling with her. They weren't celebrating the interruption, they were waiting to see if Crockett would flinch, waiting to see if Bondi's confidence would broker silence, waiting to see if anyone in that high-pressure crucible of live television dared to challenge a dismissal so arrogant, so cutting that it had frozen the room in disbelief. But no one in that room could predict how Jasmine Crockett would respond. In living rooms across the country, the broadcast wasn't just another evening segment. It was a mirror reflecting America's deepest fault lines. The network had billed the panel as a discussion on the future of free speech and democracy, but everyone watching knew this wasn't about sanitized talking points or polite disagreements. It was about culture wars tearing through families, about truth tested in the digital madhouse, about identity and dignity trampled beneath the weight of sound bites. Free speech in that moment wasn't theoretical. It was personal. It was parents praying their children wouldn't be radicalized by a viral conspiracy. It was immigrants sick of being told to go back when they'd built lives here brick by brick. It was women and minorities navigating hate channeled directly into their feeds, their inboxes, their daily existence. And it was a nation struggling to answer a question as old as democracy itself. Does liberty mean the right of the loudest voice to dominate, or the shared responsibility to ensure everyone can be heard without fear? This was the battlefield Pam Bondi strutted into, armed with confidence and dismissal. She framed herself as the protector of real America, rolling her eyes at pleas for accountability as if they were unnecessary dramas. To her, Crockett represented a new wave of politics she was eager to mold. Voices demanding respect not as charity but as right, and that mockery was the performance Bondi expected to play to her advantage before millions. But Jasmine Crockett did not rise to the bait. In the seconds after Bondi's cutting words, Crockett didn't rush to defend herself, didn't scramble to fill the silence. She simply sat, calm, composed, still. Her hands folded on the desk, her body language unshaken, her gaze piercing into the studio lights, as if she knew patience itself was a weapon. Viewers could feel it, the brewing storm, the quiet before thunder. Bondi had spoken with bluster, but Crockett's silence carried more weight than 1,000 retorts. The contrast was cinematic, one woman taking up space with arrogance, the other commanding space through control. In that gap, in those few charged moments, the stakes transformed from talking points to something bigger. Because this was no longer just a televised spat. It was about narrative, who America chose to listen to. Would it be the familiar cadence of arrogance, polished dismissal presented as confidence, or would it be the emerging voice of resilience born from lived struggle, representing millions who rarely saw themselves defended on the airwaves? Twitter feeds lit up even before Crockett spoke. Clips of her composure spread as viewers fired off speculation. She's about to shut it down. She's waiting to unload. Look at her face. Bondi has no idea what's coming. Entire threads spun from the silence alone, the internet reading anticipation the way gamblers read tension at the table. Bondi, mistaking stillness for hesitation, leaned farther into her posture of triumph. She interrupted again, tossing off a dismissive chuckle, mugging to the cameras as though the silence had validated her point. But those watching at home knew better. They had witnessed enough debates, enough defensive flailing, to recognize that discipline and conviction sit quietly before they crash. Every second Crockett didn't respond raised the heat of the moment. The air itself seemed to lean toward her chair, waiting. Studio staffers sat frozen, the host biting their lip, producers waving frantically behind glass as if wanting to orchestrate what couldn't be orchestrated. The stakes weren't just words hanging in the air. They were the dignity of millions watching, desperate for one voice to tell America that arrogance doesn't get the last word. They were democracy itself, distilled into a question: who gets to speak without fear, and who gets silenced with a smirk? Crockett remained grounded, patient, untamed by the interruption. She was not rattled, she was loading. And though no one in the studio could predict it, what she said next would cascade beyond those walls, beyond that moment, into the bloodstream of a culture aching for defiance and dignity. The moment she opened her mouth, the internet would never be the same. Pam Bondi had long mastered the art of performance under the bright lights. She knew how to sit just so, to tilt her head just enough to let a controlled smirk spread when she believed she had scored a point. To her admirers, she appeared polished, assertive, an immovable defender of what she labeled law and order. But woven beneath that composed armor was something else, an arrogance, a sense that her words required no challenge and that anyone who stood against her did so at their peril. Her career had been built on spectacle just as much as legality. A former state attorney general, she wielded her office as a platform, treating press conferences less like forums of justice and more like stages for persona. With coiffed hair, sharp blazers, and precise delivery, Bondi constructed herself as the voice of righteous indignation, always on the side of the people, always declaiming that her vision of order represented the country's moral backbone. But the unspoken truth simmered beneath. Her championing of dare often meant entrenching structures of privilege, shutting down challenges not because they lacked merit, but because they threatened the status quo she was fluent in defending. As a television commentator, Bondi understood her audience in ways some of her rivals never could. She knew her camera angles, when to dramatize outrage, when to cut in with a dismissive chuckle, when to flatten her expressions into practiced disbelief. Her goal was not persuasion, it was domination. She sought not to win arguments with substance, but to floor opponents with contempt. And for years this worked. Many were browbeaten, rattled, thrown from rhythm when faced with her interruptions and carefully sharpened dismissals. But there was always a fundamental contradiction buried in her act. She proclaimed herself a defender of democracy while justifying behavior that chipped away at it. She positioned herself as the voice of order, yet appeared only to valorize the privileged while dismissing the marginalized. She preached about responsibility and accountability while too often aligning with power that excused itself from both. For Bondi, law seemed interchangeable with loyalty to her worldview, and order seemed less about justice than about maintaining her place atop the cultural ladder. Audiences noticed it, even if they couldn't always articulate it. When she cut across challengers with her mocking smiles, she wasn't merely hearing them out, she was dismissing their right to even speak. She had perfected this posture of polished disdain, the controlled arrogance of a figure who viewed public airwaves as her courtroom and every opponent as a defendant brought there to lose. For her supporters, it was exhilarating. They cheered her certainties, her confidence, mistaking contempt for strength. But for critics, her act rang hollow, a performance of authority detached from lived stakes, a defense of principles that bent easily when privilege demanded exceptions. And herein lay Bondi's hubris. She believed confrontation was theatre she always controlled. To her, every opponent was amateur, unprepared for the dismissals she wielded with ease. Years on air built her certainty that the narrative would always return to her authority, her cadence, her polish. And so, when Jasmine Crockett sat at the opposite end of that glossy broadcast table, Bondi approached it as another routine face-off, another chance to prove dominance with a glare and a cutting word. But arrogance functions like a blindfold. Bondi could not see what waited in the silence Crockett held steady. To her, that silence was submission. To the millions watching at home, it was something far more dangerous. It was patience laced with fire, the calm rehearsed not for retreat but for strike. The villain's story is always one of hubris meeting inevitability, of confidence curdling into catalyst for downfall, and in that studio, Bondi unknowingly played her part to perfection. She looked at Crockett and saw someone she could dismiss with a quip. She looked at the cameras and assumed they would capture her authority unshaken. She believed her own cultivated image was enough to declare victory before words had even truly passed between them. But the contradictions she carried, mockery cloaked as strength, privilege disguised as principle, were about to be drawn into sharp relief. And unlike countless others she'd faced, Crockett would not shrink beneath the weight of intimidation. Because while Bondi wielded performance as her weapon, Crockett's weapon was forged not under studio lights but in real struggle, in lived battles that arrogance could never mimic and dismissal could never erase. But where Bondi wielded power as performance, Crockett carried something forged from struggle. Long before Jasmine Crockett's name was trending across timelines and quoted on cable recaps, her journey was written in the quieter rhythms of survival and persistence. She was not born into Polish connections or privilege. She came of age in neighborhoods where hope had to be carried in your own pocket because no one else would hand it to you. And for a young black woman daring to enter America's most combative spaces, the journey was paved with skepticism, dismissal, and voices whispering she'd never belong. Crockett's upbringing was her foundation. Her family instilled dignity as daily practice, not because it was simple, but precisely because the world so often tried to strip it away. In a world that rewarded arrogance in some but punished confidence in others, she learned early that persistence would have to become her armor. Teachers overlooked her, peers doubted her, institutions underestimated her. It would have been easy to shrink. Instead, Crockett chose to sharpen herself against the grindstone of low expectations, determined to rise not in spite of them but because of them. When she pursued law, it wasn't out of a detached fascination with statutes and clauses. It was necessity, purpose, and calling. She stepped into courtrooms not with pampered entitlement but with the weight of communities behind her. She represented clients who didn't have money to buy their way free from consequences, citizens who faced systemic imbalances where justice was more often a rumor than a reality. Where some saw defendants as case numbers, Crockett saw human beings, fallible, yes, but deserving of dignity. Inside those courtrooms, she learned to battle not against opposing counsel alone, but against entire systems built to wear people down. She didn't just build legal arguments, she built trust. In barbershops, community centers, church basements, she listened, she understood politics not as a product to be marketed but as a responsibility to the unheard. That authenticity is what carried her to elected office. While Pam Bondi was ushered into national platforms via the establishment machine, Crockett's rise was paved block by block, handshake by handshake, fight by fight. It is in this stark contrast that the story of hero and villain crystallizes. Bondi represented polished elitism, someone who leaned on image, privilege, and performance before cameras. Crockett represented lived America, messy, resilient, invisible to the powerful until it claimed space without asking permission. Bondi smirked into the lens. Crockett stared it down with unshakable calm. Her identity wasn't theoretical posture, it was lived strategy. Being underestimated became her superpower. For years, room after room taught her the same cold lesson, that some would dismiss her before she even spoke a word. And yet each time Crockett turned dismissal into determination. Each time she was overlooked, she refused invisibility. Each time she was told to sit down, she stood taller. Energy that could have soured into resentment became fuel, shaping her voice into one that cut through arrogance like a blade. That's what made her stand out in Congress, and why progressive audiences found in her a new beacon. She didn't merely rehearse talking points, she embodied battles most lawmakers only theorize about. She never forgot what it felt like to stand in a courtroom where the odds tilted sharply against those who lacked money or power. She never forgot the sting of being spoken over, the reckless ease with which others projected mockery onto her identity. And so, when she entered politics, she carried those memories as compass and shield. Every clash thereafter became more than a political moment. It became representation. For every silenced voice watching at home, Crockett's presence symbolized possibility. She wasn't flawless, and she didn't pose as invincible. What drew people to her was the sense that she embodied them without translation, that their stories lived inside her cadence, their pain echoed in her precision, and their hopes carried in her refusal to be dismissed. Bondi presented confidence born of power's protection. Crockett projected confidence born of survival's necessity. Bondi wielded contempt as an accessory, tossing it out like perfume sprayed before stepping into the room. Crockett turned contempt into resilience, refusing the gift of mockery while turning it into fuel for defiance. One was spectacle, the other, substance. All of this is what simmered invisibly in the studio during that live broadcast. Viewers may not have known all the details of Crockett's past, but they recognized what her calm eyes carried, a history of underestimated determination. She didn't need to rattle papers or flash statistics in that moment. The quiet patience she held was history speaking through her. Her preparation wasn't the kind found in polished talking points or focus group rehearsals. It was the kind born out of lived fights that hardened her, the kind of classroom life builds outside the spotlight. Silence for her was never weakness. Silence was gathering. Silence was sharpening. Silence was knowing that timing means everything, and that when the time did come, her words would sound not like opinion, but like undeniable truth. And that was the secret no one else on the panel saw. Bondi looked across at Crockett and saw someone she could mock. The host saw ratings. The studio crew saw a tense debate. But the millions watching at home saw something else altogether, a woman who looked like the DI. Nitty they'd been craving to see defended, and in that studio, her preparation would meet its test. The tension that had been simmering finally began to boil. When the host turned back toward Jasmine Crockett, signaling for her to respond, the Congresswoman leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice calm, her eyes steady. Viewers at home leaned forward too, sensing they were about to witness a pivot. But barely 2 sentences out of her mouth, Pam Bondi swooped in like a hawk. "Oh, please," Bondi interjected, rolling her eyes and letting a grin crawl across her face. "Spare us the moral preaching. Americans don't need condescending lectures every time someone loses an argument." The smirk lingered, smug and confident, as if she had already won. The studio audience stirred, some gasps audible, a few uneasy coughs scattered through the air. The host tried to wave his hand gently, urging restraint, but Bondi pressed herself deeper into the interruption, determined to cut Crockett off at the knees. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or fumble for dominance. Her composure remained absolute, her silence deliberate before she continued, as though Bondi's disruption were nothing more than static in the background. "Pam," she said finally, her tone measured and direct, "this isn't about who can throw the quickest insult. It's about whether free speech means respect for all Americans or just comfort for the ones who already hold power." The words landed like sparks in kindling, and murmurs swept through the studio. Bondi shifted, visibly bristling, annoyed that her interruption had been absorbed and redirected without effort. She leaned toward her mic again. "That's cute," she shot back, her smirk sharpening. "But let's be honest, people don't tune in for your sermonizing. They tune in for the truth, and frankly, you're no truth teller." Her jab drew a few awkward chuckles from her supporters on the panel, but the reaction never quite caught. The audience's attention stayed locked on Crockett, waiting for her response. And Crockett gave it, not with flash, but with absolute precision. "You keep calling it truth," she replied smoothly, "but what you really mean is control. You decide what counts as acceptable. You decide who deserves to speak and who should stay quiet. That isn't law or order. That's privilege disguising itself as justice." The weight of those words drew another round of audible murmurs, shifting uncomfortably between the cameras. Viewers at home tweeted furiously, hashtags already beginning to form. Bondi, sensing her grip slipping, barked out a short laugh. "Privilege? Don't lecture me about privilege," she snapped, trying to rise above the room with a wave of her manicured hand. "I've spent my career fighting for Americans, and frankly, I don't need a lecture from someone who's never had real responsibility on her shoulders." The temperature in the studio spiked. Even the host leaned back, uncertain whether to step in or let the duel burn. But Crockett once again didn't waver. She leaned closer to her mic, her tone still steady, but now carrying a sharper edge, each word like a scalpel slicing through the layers of Bondi's charade. "The problem," Crockett said, eyes locked on Bondi, "is that you confuse responsibility with entitlement. You've mistaken speaking over people for leading them. And it's not just insulting to me, it's insulting to every viewer at home who knows what it means to be talked over, dismissed, and silenced simply for existing in this country." A sharp intake of breath swept across the studio. Even those seated far from the desk straightened in their seats. Bondi blinked, her smirk faltering for the first time. She opened her mouth, ready with another deflection, but the timing had shifted. The oxygen in the room no longer followed her, it followed Crockett. The clash was no longer about sound bites, it had become symbolic, each word echoing further than the walls of the studio, striking directly into America's living rooms. Viewers saw through the smirk, saw through the practiced interruptions, and felt a surge of recognition in Crockett's calm fire. Bondi tried to thrust one last sarcastic chuckle into the mix. "Oh, please," she muttered, preparing to drown her opponent in dismissal again. But Crockett didn't let the interruption rattle her. Instead, she inhaled, parted her lips, and began delivering a line so sharp, so precise, that even the staff in the control room froze mid-motion. And then came the words that stopped the studio cold. The silence that followed Bondi's smirk was thick, almost unbearable. The studio lights seemed hotter now, the cameras pulling in closer, every lens fixed on Jasmine Crockett as she leaned forward into the microphone with the assurance of someone who had been here before, not on this stage under this glare, but in 1,000 moments when people just like Bondi had tried to dismiss her into silence. Her voice came measured, deliberate, not rushed, not defensive. Each word landed like it had been carved beforehand, sharpened for this exact moment. "Pam," Crockett began softly, "every time you interrupt me, every time you dismiss me mid-sentence, millions of people watching at home recognize exactly what's happening because it's what happens to them every single day." A murmur trailed through the studio audience. Some panelists shifted uncomfortably. The host leaned back in surprise, but Crockett kept going, unshaken. "There are women watching who have been talked over their entire lives. There are immigrants watching who've been told to be quiet in a country they've worked to build. There are black and brown children who've seen their parents mocked, their teachers question their intelligence, their bosses ignore their ideas. And what you just did?" She held her pause, locking eyes with Bondi across the gleaming desk. "You gave America a live demonstration of that same dismissal." Gasps erupted. The cameras cut instantly between the two women. Bondi shifting awkwardly, jaw tight behind her fixed smile. Crockett sharp, composed, unyielding. Bondi tried to laugh it off. "That's not what I meant." She rushed, her voice higher now, defensive. But Crockett refused her the satisfaction. She cut smoothly through Bondi's words without raising her volume. "No, Pam, that's exactly what you meant. Because when you claim to fight for law and order, what you're really defending is a system that gives you the authority to define who deserves voice and who doesn't. You confuse silencing with strength and you confuse arrogance with leadership. But the people watching, they see right through it." The pause that followed felt cinematic, like the kind of beat perfected in closing arguments. Commentators in the studio sat frozen, pens halted midair. Producers waved frantically through the glass, mouthing instructions. "Keep the camera tight, don't cut away, hold the shot on Crockett." She leaned in closer, her tone sharpening, a sword disguised as velvet. "You love to say you're defending freedom, but freedom doesn't exist when it's a weapon used to keep people quiet. Freedom is not what you decide, it is based on who agrees with you. Freedom means equal dignity to speak, without fear, without mockery, without double standards. And if you can't understand that, then what you're defending isn't freedom at all. It's privilege." The words detonated across the studio. Audible gasps. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Bondi shook her head rapidly, her fingers tightening in her lap, eyes darting toward the cameras as if searching for a life raft. She tried to wave it off with another chuckle, but her laughter landed wrong, strained, brittle, out of rhythm with who controlled the floor now. Crockett didn't let up. She let her silence speak for 3 beats longer, then pressed forward with her final strike. "America deserves better than sound bites soaked in arrogance. Because free speech isn't about stroking the egos of the powerful, it's about protecting the dignity of the vulnerable. It isn't about who can shout the loudest in the room, it's about ensuring no one is silenced out of existence. That's the principle, that's the promise, that's the truth." The studio fell into stunned silence. The audience, the panel, even the host stared as if something monumental had just shifted before their eyes. The cameras zoomed in tight on Bondi's face. No smirk now, just discomfort etched in her jaw, her attempted composure unraveling live, frame by frame. Commentators whispered off mic. One crew member mouthed "wow" to another behind the glass. Twitter feeds exploded in real time as viewers clipped the exchange and began firing it into the bloodstream of social media. But inside the studio there was only that stillness, carved sharp with the weight of what had just been said. Crockett sat back in her chair finally, composed as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But everyone else knew different. Something irreversible had unfolded in that room. Her final words hung in the air like a verdict rendered, and with them came a silence not of dismissal but of awe. Because Crockett had done what countless others failed to, strip a performance of arrogance, and replace it with truth, and what followed in the hours after would set the internet on fire. The broadcast hadn't even finished before the internet caught fire. Seconds after Jasmine Crockett's final words left her lips, clips of the exchange began tearing across social platforms at light speed. On X Twitter, hashtags shot to the top of worldwide trends. Crockett clapback, # Bondi shutdown, # free each with dignity. By midnight, they had racked up millions of mentions, with Crockett's calm takedown looping endlessly in timelines, dissected frame by frame. Meme crafters moved at lightning pace. Screenshots of Bondi's faltering smirk circulated with captions like, "When the math ain't mathing," and "That face when you realize arrogance isn't bulletproof." Side-by-side edits compared Crockett's unshaken stare with Bondi's forced laughter, branding the moment the look that ended the argument. TikTok spun it into duets, teenagers reenacting the exchange with laughter and pride. What hit hardest wasn't just Crockett's words. It was the composure, the silence she held, the precision she carried, that audiences found unforgettable. Viewers replayed her pauses as if they were dance beats, treating patience itself as a weapon. One viral tweet captured the mood perfectly. Pam Bondi brought a smirk. Jasmine Crockett brought the entire Constitution. By dawn, celebrities had weighed in. Comedians, musicians, and cultural icons posted clips with fire emojis, applause gifs, and cheering captions. Civil rights leaders shared Crockett's words alongside their own reflections on resilience and truth. Even international commentators chimed in, framing it as a universal story. This is what happens when privilege meets preparation. Politicians, too, couldn't resist. Progressive lawmakers praised Crockett as the voice of a generation tired of arrogance masquerading as leadership. Editorial writers dubbed it the viral moment America didn't know it needed. Even some conservatives admitted begrudgingly that her sharp contrast to Bondi's smugness had landed powerfully, even if they disagreed with her politics. Bondi, however, couldn't escape the firestorm. She logged onto social media only to find her brand of smirking certainty transformed into parody fodder. Late-night hosts looped clips of her interruptions, only to pause them for dramatic effect as Crockett's rebuttals stole the spotlight. Commentators ridiculed her attempt to laugh off the moment. When you laugh, but everyone knows you lost. Within hours, Crockett's performance transcended the category of political drama and became a cultural moment. Teachers played the clip in classrooms to talk about debate and respect. Activists folded her words into speeches. Hashtags bled off the internet and onto protest signs. Even sports commentators joked during broadcasts. That was a real Crockett clapback right there. The ripple effect had its own cinematic quality. This wasn't simply about Crockett versus Bondi anymore. It was about what millions watching decided it meant for them. On Instagram, young women posted captions quoting her words about dismissal. Immigrant families shared clips alongside stories of being told to be quiet or stay in their lane. Parents tweeted lines like, "This is the kind of composure I want my kids to grow up with." Bondi's allies scrambled, spinning narratives that she had been ambushed or misunderstood. But the momentum wasn't theirs anymore. The cultural center of gravity had shifted. The viral clip was no longer under Bondi's control, nor truthfully Crockett's. It belonged to the audience now, a collective myth, retold, retweeted, reframed with each post. What viewers experienced wasn't just a demolition of arrogance, but the catharsis of recognition. Millions who had lived the everyday reality of being silenced, dismissed, or mocked now saw themselves in Crockett's poise and precision. It was validation delivered live on air, a moment that cracked the facade of untouchable privilege and let dignity shine through. It wasn't just politics, it was identity, it was survival, it was America's future being fought over, not in abstract philosophy, but in the lived truth of who gets to speak and who gets told to shut up. The crescendo of that night echoed louder with every repost, every article, every late-night monologue. The world didn't just watch Crockett clap back at Bondi, it watched dignity reclaim center stage from arrogance. It watched privilege lose ground to authenticity. It wasn't just a moment. It became a movement. But beneath the noise, there was a deeper lesson waiting. As the firestorm burned across headlines, timelines, and late-night stages, Jasmine Crockett herself remained steady, refusing to revel in the mockery that consumed Pam Bondi's image. For Crockett, the moment had never been about personal victory. It was about something far larger, something America has wrestled with since its founding. Who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and what freedom truly means. She knew that arrogance, no matter how polished, was not strength. It was fragile. It cracked the moment it collided with truth. And by sitting calm under Bondi's dismissals, by responding not with rage but with clarity, Crockett reminded millions that composure has its own power, that dignity doesn't just endure mockery, it outshines it. Her lesson was not for Pam Bondi alone. It was for America itself. Free speech is not a trophy reserved for billionaires, celebrities, or political elites to brandish at will. It is not a sword for the powerful to wield against the vulnerable. Speech becomes sacred only when it carries responsibility with it. Responsibility to truth, to empathy, to the dignity of all who inhabit this country. She reframed the clash in universal terms. In an era drowning in ego-driven noise, Crockett offered a simple counter. Democracy's strength is not measured by the arrogance of individuals who dominate the floor, but by the resilience of voices who insist on being heard despite attempts to shut them down. The internet echoed it, turning her final words into a creed. Free speech without dignity is not freedom, it's chaos disguised as liberty. To Americans who had felt dismissed, unseen, or mocked, it was a reminder that democracy extends beyond volume, and that empathy is not weakness, but the foundation of collective strength. Crockett's composure became a symbol of resistance in its own right. She reminded parents teaching children to raise their hands in class, workers overlooked in crowded meetings, citizens dismissed in the public square, that being talked over does not mean you have nothing to say. Holding your ground with honesty and conviction can shake the room louder than any smirk. Her resolution carried an almost spiritual ring, as if channeling America's deeper promise. Arrogance fades, empires of ego crumble. But dignity, chosen, practiced, defended, lasts. And that is why her voice mattered, not because it humiliated one adversary on live television, but because it reminded an entire country that America is strongest not when one voice dominates, but when every voice counts. The inspirational crescendo of her message was clear. To speak and be heard is not a privilege, it is a right sealed not only in law but in identity and in justice. And the true test of a democracy is not how loud its most powerful voices can shout, but how faithfully it protects those who dare to speak quietly, courageously from its margins. For Jasmine Crockett, it was never about the clash itself. It was always about the lesson. America cannot confuse arrogance with leadership. It cannot elevate ego and call it patriotism. True Americanness, its survival, its beauty, its enduring possibility has always come from empathy, humility, and the key, conviction that collective resilience matters more than domination. So while the headlines roared and the internet exploded in awe, Crockett left viewers with something far more enduring, a sense that justice and dignity belong to everyone, not to the smirking elite, not to those who weaponize speech as performance, but to each ordinary citizen who insists on being heard. And in that reminder, something remarkable happened. Outrage gave way to inspiration. Laughter gave way to reflection. A viral moment transformed into a lasting message that America is not defined by who interrupts the loudest, but by who listens the deepest. Dignity over arrogance, empathy over ego, justice over spectacle. These are not just political values, they are American values. And in that studio, amidst the heat of cameras and the clash of egos, Jasmine Crockett reclaimed them. Pam Bondi walked into that broadcast, certain of her dominance. She carried the smirk of someone who thought confidence alone could silence her opponent, who believed interruption was the same thing as authority. But when the final words left Jasmine Crockett's lips, the atmosphere shifted. The lights still blazed, the cameras still rolled, but the studio had fallen silent, not in Bondi's victory, but in Crockett's undeniable truth. That silence was the real headline. It wasn't emptiness, it was impact. It was the echo of a nation realizing in real time that dignity speaks louder than arrogance. Crockett didn't just push back. She reframed the entire conversation. She reminded America in front of millions that free speech isn't the weapon of the powerful. It belongs to everyone, to parents, to workers, to dreamers, to immigrants building lives, to every citizen who refuses to be dismissed. And that's why this moment matters, because truth doesn't serve celebrity, it doesn't bow to privilege. Truth and the justice rooted within it belongs to the people. Crockett made that clear. Not with shouting, but with clarity. Not with interruption, but with conviction. Now the question becomes, what do we do with that silence she left in the air? Do we let it fade or do we turn it into a movement? That's up to us. If her words moved you, if you felt that dignity strike deeper than Bondi's smirk ever could, then don't let this moment disappear into yesterday's news cycle. Share it, speak it, carry it. Join the community that refuses to let arrogance define America's future. Subscribe to this channel, add your voice in the comments, spread this clip, this message, this vision of justice-forward dialogue. Because Bondi may have walked in confident, but Crockett's words reminded us all, the real power belongs to us.